You'll be shocked when you learn how Native Americans survived the winter. The Appalachian Mountains in winter are a land of harsh, pristine beauty and deadly cold. Here, far from civilization, the first settlers fought a daily battle for survival. Their weapons were not rifles, but axes, ingenuity, and a deep understanding of the laws of nature. They built their homes not just as shelters, but as veritable thermoses capable of preserving precious warmth in the midst of an icy hell. Every log, every stone in the hearth was part of a well-thought-out survival strategy. It was a silent war where the price of defeat was life itself. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how simple clay and moss turned a log cabin into an impregnable fortress against the cold. And what was the main secret that allowed families not to freeze in their sleep when the fire in the hearth was almost extinguished? What if I told you that the main battle against the cold took place not at the stove, but in the human mind? The first and most formidable enemy of the settler was not the blizzard outside the window, but the feeling of isolation and despair. The long winter months in a confined space required incredible psychological fortitude. The basis for survival was a strict daily routine carried out automatically. Each member of the family knew their task: chopping wood, repairing tools, cooking, spinning. The routine created the illusion of control over the chaos and left no time for gloomy thoughts. The awareness that no help would come until spring meant that they had to rely only on themselves and their family. This harsh reality shaped a special type of character: resilient, patient, and incredibly resourceful. The ability to remain calm and clear-headed in a critical situation was valued more highly than physical strength. Long evenings were spent by the light of the hearth, telling stories and passing on family traditions from mouth to mouth. This was not just entertainment, but a way to maintain the connection between generations and strengthen family ties. Shared laughter and quiet conversation were the best cure for winter blues. People learned to find joy in small things: in a sunny day after a long snowstorm, in the warmth of the hearth, in hot soup. They understood that their lives depended on harmony with nature, not on fighting it. It was a philosophy of acceptance, not conquest. Preparations for winter began long before the first cold spells, and this was also part of a psychological adaptation. Every bundle of herbs gathered, every jar of pickles was a small victory over the coming winter. This process gave people confidence in their own strength. They lived in tune with nature, going to bed at sunset and waking up at dawn to make the most of the short daylight hours. This life, synchronized with the sun, helped them maintain their inner balance. The absence of the hustle and bustle of the modern world was their unconscious advantage. They understood that panic was a direct path to destruction. Any rash action, such as going outside in a heavy snowstorm, could be their last. Coolness and calculation were the main tools for survival. Neighbors, even those living several kilometers apart, were part of a unified support system. The very fact that you were not alone in this icy world, that there was a similar family within reach, gave you strength. This invisible social network was a lifeline. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. Do you think modern people, accustomed to comfort and constant communication, could withstand such psychological stress? Write about it in the comments. Are you ready to learn the truth about the most important part of a settler's hut? The central element of any dwelling in the Appalachians was the hearth, or, later, the cast iron stove. It was not just a device for heating, but the pulsating heart of the home, on which the life of the whole family depended. The design of the hearth was the result of centuries of experience. It was built of wild stone and clay, with careful consideration given to the size of the firebox and the height of the chimney. A properly constructed hearth provided maximum heat and efficiently removed smoke. Fire was not only a source of heat, but also of light during the long winter evenings. It was the center of social life. The whole family gathered around the fire to have dinner, work, or just talk. The flames created a unique atmosphere of comfort and security in the midst of a hostile world. All food was cooked over the fire, from simple bread to hearty soups made from dried meat and root vegetables. Cast iron pots and pans were the main tools of the housewife. The ability to cook over an open fire was an art that was passed down from generation to generation. Maintaining the fire was a continuous process that required constant attention. Firewood had to be added regularly, day and night. This duty was one of the most important in the family. The hearth was also used to dry wet clothes and shoes. Special wooden hangers and hooks were always hung with socks and shirts. Keeping clothes dry was one of the main rules for preventing disease. The heat from the hearth was distributed unevenly, so life in the hut was built around it. Sleeping places were located as close as possible to the heat source. The far corners of the house remained cold and were used as storage rooms. The quality of the firewood was of great importance. Hardwoods such as oak or hickory burned for a long time and gave off a lot of heat. Softwoods such as pine burned quickly and produced a lot of soot. Maintaining the chimney was another critical task. A chimney clogged with soot could cause a fire or carbon monoxide poisoning. It was cleaned regularly with special brushes or simply a bundle of sticks. But a simple fire is useless if all the heat escapes instantly. What if I told you that the main secret to their survival was hidden not in the fire itself, but in the walls of the hut? In the next chapter, you will learn how the settlers turned their homes into real thermoses. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of the pioneering builders. A log wall alone could not retain heat. The settlers' main enemy was the countless gaps between the logs, through which precious heat escaped and icy wind penetrated inside. The process of sealing these gaps was a real art and had its own name: chinging and daubing. It was the most labor-intensive and responsible stage of construction. The quality of this work directly determined whether the family would survive the winter. First, the large gaps between the logs were filled, or chinked, with any available material. This could be pieces of wood, stones, or most often dried moss. Moss was the ideal insulator. It is elastic, retains heat well, and does not rot. Then came the daubing stage, applying a sealing coating. Its composition was unique to each locality, but the base was always the same: clay. Clay was an affordable and completely free building material. Reinforcing components were added to the clay for strength. These could be dry grass, straw, or other plant fibers. After drying, this mixture became strong and did not crack. The mixture was thoroughly mixed with water to the consistency of thick dough. Then it was applied by hand over the moss, tightly filling all cracks and voids. The work was dirty and required a lot of patience. This layer of clay plaster created a virtually airtight barrier. It prevented the wind from blowing through the walls and kept the warm air inside the room. The hut turned into a kind of thermos. The sealing process was not a one-time thing. Every year before the onset of cold weather, the owner of the house carefully inspected the walls. Any cracks and gaps that appeared were immediately filled with a new batch of clay mixture. Particular attention was paid to the corners of the house and the places where the window and door frames joined. These were the most vulnerable places through which most of the heat escaped. They were sealed with particular care. It was this simple but effective technology that allowed the hut to maintain an acceptable temperature even in the most severe frosts. It was a triumph of ingenuity over a lack of resources. They created heat-efficient houses long before the advent of modern insulation materials. Guess how long it took to prepare firewood for one winter? Firewood preparation was not a seasonal job, but a year-round process. Survival in winter depended directly on the size and quality of the wood pile stacked next to the house. The process began in winter or early spring. Men went into the forest to select and cut down suitable trees. It was easier to do this in winter, as the snow made it easier to transport the logs out of the forest. The felled trees were sawn into logs of the required length and transported to the house. Here the next stage began: chopping wood. It was hard physical work that required strength and skill. The split logs were stacked in a woodpile, or woodshed. This was not just a chaotic pile of wood, but an entire engineering structure. A properly stacked woodpile provided good ventilation, which was key to drying the wood properly. Firewood had to dry for at least one summer. Dry wood burns hotter and produces less smoke and soot. Using wet wood was inefficient and dangerous, as it could extinguish the fire and clog the chimney. The size of the woodpile was an indicator of the owner's foresight and diligence. A huge, neatly stacked supply of firewood, which could reach the height of the house, was a source of pride. It guaranteed that the family would survive even the longest and harshest winter. The location of the woodshed was also important. It was often built against one of the walls of the house to provide additional protection from the wind. At the same time, it had to be at a safe distance from the hearth to avoid accidental fire. In addition to the main supply, a small amount of firewood was always kept inside the house near the hearth. This allowed the wood to dry completely before use. Warm and dry logs burned instantly. Kindling was also an art. Thin chips, dry bark, or special tarred splinters were used for this purpose. The ability to quickly light a fire was a vital skill, but even with a sealed house and a mountain of firewood, night brought with it a special danger. In the next chapter, you will learn about a silent enemy that crept into the house while everyone was asleep. Ready to learn more? When darkness fell, the battle against the cold entered its most critical phase. At night, the temperature outside dropped sharply, and any mistake could be fatal. The main task was to prevent the fire in the hearth from going out completely before morning. To this end, there was a whole system of night watches. Family members took turns waking up in the middle of the night to throw a few logs on the fire. This restless sleep was the price of survival. Before going to bed, the fire was prepared in a special way. It was covered with a thick layer of ash to slow down the burning. This allowed the coals to smolder for several hours, retaining their heat. In the morning, the first person to wake up simply had to rake the ashes and put small chips of wood on the smoldering coals. This allowed them to quickly fan a new flame without the need for flint and tinder. Losing a living fire was considered a very bad omen. The temperature in the hut fluctuated greatly during the night. Towards morning, it became very cold in the house, especially away from the hearth. People slept in their clothes, covering themselves with several layers of blankets and skins. Often, special box beds with high sides and even a roof were used for sleeping. This design protected against drafts and better retained the heat of the sleeping bodies. It was a kind of house within a house. Sometimes heated stones were used for additional heating. Large flat stones were heated by the hearth, wrapped in cloth, and placed in bed. They slowly gave off heat for several hours. The most dangerous thing was to fall asleep and miss your turn on duty. If the fire went out completely, the temperature in the house began to drop rapidly. It was very difficult to light a new fire with frozen wood. Waking up in a cold, dark house was a harsh ordeal. The first thing to do was to restore the flame, and only then could one think about breakfast and other matters. The morning fire was a symbol of a new small victory over winter. This daily and nightly struggle for warmth tempered character. It taught responsibility, discipline, and mutual assistance. In this harsh world, every member of the family, from the youngest to the oldest, contributed to the common survival. What if I told you that everything you've been taught about pioneer food is outdated? Survival in winter depended not only on warmth, but also on food supplies. In the fall, every family worked tirelessly to preserve the harvest and provide themselves with provisions until the following spring. The main storage place for supplies was the root cellar. It was a room dug under or next to the house below the frost line. The temperature in such a cellar remained stable and cool all year round. Root vegetables were stored here: potatoes, turnips, carrots, and parsnips. They were poured into special bins or simply stored in boxes with sand. In such conditions, they could lie until spring without losing their qualities. Rows of clay pots and wooden barrels stood on the cellar shelves. They were used to store pickles, sauerkraut, and pickled apples. Fermentation was one of the main methods of preservation, allowing vitamins to be retained. Meat and fish were preserved by salting, drying, and smoking. Hams and bundles of dried fish were hung from the ceiling in a cool shed or attic. These products were the main source of protein in the winter diet. Mushrooms, berries, and herbs were dried by spreading them in a thin layer in the attic or stringing them on threads. When dried, they took up little space and could be stored for a very long time. They were used to make soups, teas, and medicinal decoctions. Grains such as corn and wheat were stored in special barns protected from rodents. Before use, the grain was ground into flour using hand mills. Freshly baked bread was the main food on the table. Fats also played an important role in the winter diet, providing the necessary energy. Lard was salted, and animal fat was melted down and stored in pots. It was used for cooking and even for lighting. Proper storage was the key to success. Food was regularly sorted through so that spoiled items could be noticed and removed in time. Losing part of the supply due to improper storage could be a real disaster. Having a full cellar gave the family a sense of confidence and security, but having a full stomach was only half the battle. In the next chapter, you will learn how settlers protected their own bodies from the cold when they had to leave their homes. The settlers' clothing was not a tribute to fashion, but a vital tool for survival. It had to be durable, functional, and most importantly, warm. The basis of the winter wardrobe was natural materials: wool, leather, and linen. The main secret to protection from the cold was the principle of layering. Instead of one thick sweater, they wore several layers of thinner clothing. This created air pockets, which are the best insulators. The first layer next to the body was a long shirt made of linen or cotton. Its purpose was to absorb sweat and keep the skin dry. Wet clothes in the cold are a direct path to hypothermia. One or more woolen sweaters or vests were worn over the shirt. Wool is unique in that it continues to warm even when wet. This made it an indispensable material for harsh winters. Outerwear consisted of jackets or coats made of thick cloth or tan leather. Leather provided excellent protection from the wind and cloth from the cold. These materials were often combined. Special attention was paid to protecting the feet. Woolen stockings, sometimes several pairs at once, and high leather boots were a must. Dry grass or straw could be placed inside the boots for additional warmth. Hands were protected with knitted mittens or leather gloves. Mittens are warmer than gloves because the fingers are together and keep each other warm. Gloves with a fold-down top were often used for working in the cold. The head and neck were protected with woolen hats and scarves. A huge amount of heat escapes through an uncovered head. A scarf, in turn, allowed the face to be covered from the icy wind. All clothing was loose and did not restrict movement. Clothing that was too tight impaired blood circulation, which led to rapid freezing of the extremities. Functionality was always more important than appearance. Clothing care was a constant concern. Any holes were immediately sewn up, and torn-off buttons were sewn back on. Health and life depended on the integrity of this armor. In the Appalachian winter, any outdoor work carried the risk of frostbite. Settlers did not have access to medicine, so prevention was their main weapon against this danger. They knew the rules of behavior in the cold inside out. The main rule was, don't go outside hungry. Before any work in the cold, it was necessary to eat a hearty meal. Calorie-rich food gives the body energy, which is used to warm the body. The second rule is to keep moving. Movement increases blood circulation, especially in the extremities, which suffer from the cold first. If they had to stand still, they shifted from foot to foot and waved their arms. Protecting the face was critically important. Strong winds combined with freezing temperatures could cause frostbite on the cheeks, nose, and ears in a matter of minutes. They wrapped their faces in scarves, leaving only a narrow slit for their eyes. Exposed areas of skin were sometimes coated with animal fat. A thin layer of fat created a protective film that shielded the skin from the wind and cold. It was a simple but effective method. They kept a close eye on each other's condition. A white spot on a comrade's cheek or nose was a sure sign of the onset of frostbite. In this case, it was necessary to immediately return to warmth and gently warm the affected area. It was strictly forbidden to rub the frostbitten area with snow, as is sometimes advised. This barbaric method only damages the frozen skin and blood vessels. Warming up had to be gradual. Shoes should always be dry and loose. Wet feet freeze instantly in the cold. Shoes that are too tight squeeze the blood vessels and disrupt blood circulation. They tried to keep their hands warm by working with mittens. If they needed to do delicate work with their bare hands, they did it very quickly. After that, they immediately hid their hands back in the warmth. The settlers learned to listen to their bodies. A tingling sensation, numbness, loss of sensitivity. These were all warning signs. They could not be ignored. It was necessary to immediately seek shelter and warmth. In winter, the days became short and the nights long and dark. Providing the house with light and water became a difficult daily task. Not only comfort depended on solving this problem, but also the very possibility of running the household. Snow became the main source of water in winter. When streams and rivers froze over, the only way to get water was to melt it. Large pots of snow were constantly kept by the hearth. This process was laborious. To get one bucket of water, it was necessary to melt several buckets of snow. This water was used for drinking, cooking, and hygiene. The purity of the snow was important. For drinking and cooking, they tried to use clean, freshly fallen snow rather than snow that had settled and become dirty. Sometimes the water was additionally filtered through cloth. Light was no less valuable than water. The main source of light during the dark hours of the day was the fire in the hearth. However, its light was only enough for a small area around it. Homemade candles or oil lamps were used for local lighting. Candles were made from animal fat, lard, or beeswax. The wick was made from twisted threads. A fat lamp, or ploshka, was a simple container with fat into which a wick was lowered. It gave off a dim, smoky light, but in complete darkness, even that was a blessing. Such lamps required constant supervision. Any work that required good lighting, such as sewing or repairing small tools, was done during the day by the window. The short daylight hours were worth their weight in gold. With the onset of twilight, active activity ceased. Careful use of light was the norm. Candles were lit only when necessary and extinguished when they were no longer needed. Every stub was counted. Thus, life in winter was governed by the rhythm of light and darkness. The family rose at dawn and went to bed shortly after sunset. This simple routine helped to conserve resources and energy. Despite physical isolation, winter was not a time of complete solitude. It was a time to strengthen family ties and do the work that there was no time for in summer. The hut became the center of a small universe. Winter was a time for crafts. Men repaired agricultural equipment, made furniture, and carved wooden dishes and toys. Women spun wool, wove cloth, sewed, and mended clothes for the whole family. It was a time for passing on knowledge. The elders taught the younger ones the wisdom of their craft and told stories of their family and their people. The hearth was where the new generation was raised. Music was an important part of winter evenings. The violin, banjo, or simply singing helped pass the time and lift the spirits. Musical traditions were passed down in the same way as craft skills. Reading, if the family was literate and had books, became the main entertainment. Most often it was the Bible or a few other books that were read until they were worn out. Every printed word was highly valued. Simple games such as checkers, chess, or dice also helped to combat boredom. Game boards and pieces were often carved from wood by hand. This developed not only ingenuity, but also fine motor skills. Relationships with close neighbors were maintained despite the distances involved. In good weather, it was possible to visit neighbors by sleigh. Such visits were a real event and a celebration. During these meetings, people exchanged news, shared experiences, and helped each other with advice. The sense of community, the realization that you were not alone in facing difficulties, was very important psychological support. Winter was a time for planning. Gazing into the fire, the master of the house would think about which fields to sow in the spring and which tools needed to be repaired or made. It was a time for strategic decisions on which the future harvest depended. Thus, winter was not a dead season. It was a time of inner, focused life when the family became even stronger and more united. It was this inner strength that allowed them to wait for the first spring thaw. We see that survival in the harsh Appalachian winters was not a miracle, but the result of a system of knowledge, hard work, and incredible strength of spirit. Every detail of daily life, from sealing cracks in the walls to keeping watch by the fire at night, was part of a unified strategy. The settlers created a unique culture of survival, where foresight was the main weapon. They turned their homes into veritable fortresses capable of withstanding any frost. They learned to live in harmony with the harsh natural environment, using its gifts and obeying its laws. This experience is a harsh but important lesson in human resilience and the ability to adapt to the most difficult conditions. What other aspects of survival or pioneer stories would you like to see on our channel? Suggest your topics in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our new explorations of the past.